Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wise About Wildfire webinar, hosted by the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. We are so pleased to have all of you here with us today. I'm Taylor Mosman of Wildland Urban Interface Specialist in Central Utah, and our team will guide you through the webinar today and through the following weeks. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be put on the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands YouTube channel. If you do not wish to have your voice or image recorded, please do not speak and turn off your camera during the call. If you have any technical issues today, you may direct them to Carl Hunt in the chat box. Please keep yourself muted for the duration of the presentation and submit any questions in the chat box. There will be an opportunity for a live question and answer at the end. So to get us started today, please welcome Yana Valachovic. I think you're muted, Yana.
New, trying to learn the technology. Good evening, everyone. My name is Yana Valachovic. How's my audio sounding?
We've got you.
Okay, great. So Taylor brought me into this program. I'm from California. I know I'm a ways away from your world, but I spent a lot of time in the wildfire mitigation space, and I hope to offer some insight and share some ideas, tell some stories, and be available to attempt to kind of talk about how we transition. I think many of us have been caught off guard with this idea that, the world that we knew is not the world that we live in anymore. And let's see. Am I in the right space now for you all? Can you speak, Taylor? Let me know.
So I can see your presentation, like the next slide piece.
Okay, then I'm in the wrong. Sorry, I just swapped the wrong.
No worries.
Is that right now?
Yes, that looks perfect.
Okay, great. Sorry, I have two monitors and sometimes it gets a bit confusing which one goes where. So anyway, what I'm going to do today is offer some stories from California. And I want to highlight two particular fires that I think offer a lot to learn from. And I want to put you a bit in the detective space and then use that information around what happened in certain wildfires, one in California and one in Colorado, and use that as an opportunity for learning and thinking about pathways to fire to our properties and to the structures on our properties that we value. And I'll try and keep it interactive. I know it's a little hard in the I'm the presenter and we're not in the same room together. So I hope we can make that work. So as I said, I'm with the University of California. I'm an extension agent. I also work with the California Fire Science Consortium. There is a consortium in your region. And many of the ideas that I'm reflecting here come from collaborations that I've had a small hand in, and that may grow over time with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. My co-author is Dr. Steve Quarles. He's worked with the Insurance Institute as well as with our program here in California. So, it's weird to have someone coming from the outside. I just thought I'd offer a little insight. This is home for me. This is not where I live every day, but where I was born and raised and where our family property is. So I'm deeply rural, and I understand self-reliance. I understand what it takes to live on your own in a place that's far flung from services, and think about what are the resources that I have within my capacity, and what can I expect going forward. So I know this isn't quite like the landscape that you are all from, but I just thought it might give some insight to who I am. So I have about 45, 50 minutes of thinking here, and I'll take you down a pathway. And really, I'd like to start with a reflexive question. You all are here today, which is a huge, huge step. So there must be some reason that you were brought here today. And I know we can't create dialogue, but maybe does the chat function work, Taylor?
Yes, you should all be able to utilize the chat function. And if you have a question at any moment, you can use the raise your hand function, and I can call on you. Yana, I don't know if you can see. Can you see that?
No, I can't see you all, so that's why I'm going to rely on you, Taylor. So I'd love it if you wouldn't write into the chat a few ideas about, what's the most important action you can be taking right now in advance of the wildfire season? What are you all thinking about? And there's no right or wrong. Coming to get more information, terrific, and that's why you're here. But what else are you thinking about? And so maybe, Taylor, you can read me a couple ideas in the chat if you see them. I just want to create a little engagement here.
Yeah, I love that idea. While you guys are thinking about what you've got planned, here in Utah, just to put into perspective for you, Yana, we have been getting more moisture than ever before. We actually recently just topped our previous year of 1983. We had really bad flooding, and so this year it's really hard to put wildfire into perspective when we've got several feet of snow outside our doorstep. But I think that's a great thing to be thinking about right now before it becomes an issue. And we need to start planning, start preparing, and make a plan before that becomes a problem.
Right.
So some comments we've got are planning, and then community mitigation education for the public.
Yeah, right. Perfect ideas. I mean, have you thought about what it really takes to make a family communication plan? I ask people where they're going to be when the wildfire strikes. And I don't know if you've thought about this, but the most common answer I get is home. I'm going to be at home. What I've learned over the many years I've lived is that's rarely true. And so the question is, what have you done when you leave your home last that puts your home in the best possible position? Because you often can't go back. And a lot of folks have an action plan that involves an evacuation warning or an alert. And so there's a lot of, a set of last minute tasks that you might be doing. But what if you don't get that opportunity? And so you need to be thinking in this space about being ready for the fire season and being ready for, the unexpected. I just encourage you to be thinking about what that might mean. I think snow and wind and rain also stimulate probably some post-winter season activity and cleanup perhaps. And maybe as you're doing some of that, you could also be thinking about how those actions might help you weather the upcoming fire season. So food for thought here. And there's a lot in this space, and maybe we can revisit this at the end. And Taylor, maybe you can help me remember this question based on what we talk about at the end. So going forward, I just want a little context. I know that Utah's has also been experiencing an enhanced fire season, but for perspective in California, 1 out of every 8 acres in 100,000 acres of California has burned in the last 10 years. We've lost over 43,000 structures and 173 lives. This is a game changer. We're in such a different place than where we were just a few years ago. And, my jaw drops one season after the next by the next set of calamities that have come forward. Now, this is not to say that California does it right. I just want to give some perspective, and I don't know enough about Utah and your policies, but we've really worked in California in an evolutionary perspective around fire preparedness. And I would say that tragedy stimulates action, and there's a lag between those events. But we've been at, some type of fire preparedness and mitigation since the mid 60s. And I'm not going to go into exhaustive detail, but just to share that there's been an evolution in thinking. And really the first actions were around kind of managing the vegetation and fuels around buildings. And it was really put forward in a forest fire framing. Smokey the Bear was pretty good at enabling us to think in that way. Now I think we have a better understanding, though I don't think the public gets this very well, that we lose in California more homes in non-forest related wildfires than in forest related wildfires. And it's a problem, wildfires cause impact and home loss and damage in every ecosystem type, whether it be shrub, whether it be grassland, whether it be some transition between a conifer forest and maybe an oak woodland. It's not just the log cabin in the woods. It's really every landscape. So in that framing, we have created different actions for how different agencies respond. We've created standards for building related to evacuation and two-way roads and access, subdivision essential standards. Some of you all might remember the Oakland Hills fire in the early 90s, and that really put us on a pretty significant change of course. What it ultimately led to was the expansion of our management of vegetation, which we call defensible space, out to 100 feet. And it also created the first novel set of exterior building codes for the exterior envelope of the building from a wildfire view. We already had standards and have standards for interior fire management, but really trying to think about the building envelope. And it's the way California has done it has been different than the international WUI code. And I'm going to use the term WUI, which is the wildland urban interface. It's that transition between like a very dense city and then where there's a dispersed level of housing with more wildland interspersed in between. And that code, so, we've got standards for vegetation management, we've got standards for the exterior performance, we've got guidance around where and how you can build, and we're continuing to refine that. And, we've got folks that have mandatory authority to be able to respond, as well as to give review and inspection on how things are going at the home. One of the most interesting pieces of legislation that's happened recently, and it's a number of years old now, but there is now even a disclosure process that when you buy a new house or you sell a house, there's a disclosure that says, here's the defensible space action that's happened, and here's how the building has been hardened to wildfire, or has it? And it's not meant to say this is the standard you need to live to be able to sell or buy a property, but it's to inform and create informed consent to the transaction itself. And I think it's going to be a very effective tool in trying to communicate, and you as a future buyer understand what you're getting under or getting into. So enough about that, but just to say, we've been thinking about it for a while. I know that Oregon, for example, is trying to take a lot of this all in one big bite right now. And it's a lot to take on all at once. I don't know that we've got it right. I think, it's really an evolution in thought and science and an adaptation to that new sets of information. And, this is definitely going to be one of those destiny things, a journey thing instead of one of those destiny pieces. Within that, and I mentioned earlier this idea that wildfire is not just a forest fire condition. These are some graphics that were used in 2006 when the defensible space standards moved out to 100 feet or if the property line was closer than that. And I think the mental framing was really about how we created, and I've added some clip art on top of this, so the red and yellow is my clip art, how we create a defendable space under the assumption that there's going to be resources and personnel that are able to come and safely protect the property by staging equipment on the property and personnel to be able to do that. The goal was really to manage fire so that it approached the property at a not too tall of a flame length so that it was possible to take direct attack. I think what we've learned in California over the last decade has been it's not possible to protect every home with crews and resources. And, our emergency personnel are largely focused on evacuation and getting people out of harm's way. And so the properties themselves are often left on their own. And we have sort of prepared them not for that condition. And so we've lost a lot of homes because of that. So I don't know if you're in the mental space of thinking about forests only or thinking about there's going to be emergency personnel response. I've moved as an educator to really come to the perspective that I want to help people think about everything they can do to protect their property in advance and feel some level of confidence that when an evacuation is triggered, that you feel like, okay, I've done all the things and my place has a much better chance of survival because I've done all the things. So with that, what I've got set up today is to talk about the 2018 Camp Fire, which is the one that took place in Paradise, California. It really had a lot of media attention. I'm sure you've heard about it. And then I also want to talk about the Marshall Fire that was from December 2021. It took place on New Year's Eve, and I was able to tour both these fires, but the Marshall Fire just right after the wildfire. Using those as places to illustrate some of the challenges and, as I said, sort of create the detective process and trying to understand what the pathways are and how we can see that on individual properties. And then I'm going to wrap up with some sort of concluding big picture thoughts. So as I start that, I'm going to talk about some of the general factors that contribute to home loss and help you understand how I frame the issues and so what lens I'm using when I go in and do a post-fire investigation to be able to try and interpolate what happened in an individual setting and figure out if there's ways that we can cut off that pathway for fire exposure or be able to anticipate that and harden the structure to the best of our abilities in those individual pathways if we can't fully control them. I work with some folks with the Forest Service, so you'll see the Forest Service logo on a few of these images, and that was in specific relation to a study we did on the Camp Fire. So to kick us off, I don't know if you're familiar with this vocabulary, but I really encourage you to embrace it because I think in understanding pathways, we have to sort of understand what the exposure potentials are. And most of the broad scale educational messages have been about modifying, as showing on the left, the continuity of fuels and the pathway that fire can come from somewhere else and come towards our properties and be brought forward to the structure itself and create, flames touching the house. We call that direct flame contact. And our defensible space strategies are really designed to try and see if we can, interrupt those pathways and manage that. That has been where 99% of our educational messaging has been. But I think we now understand that there are two other very significant forms of fire exposure. And one of those are embers, where you get long distance transport of burning pieces of vegetation, generally from a woody fuel. So a shrub, a tree, something of that nature that gets picked up in the air column and moved long distance. And that's how you get spot fires starting in front of the flaming front. And those embers can land adjacent to our buildings and ignite combustibles adjacent to the building. They can land in the gutter. If you've got a lot of debris in the gutter, they can create a gutter fire. They can penetrate a vent, which is designed for two-way air exchange to let hot moisture out, but it also can let embers in. They can enter through a dog door, a cat door, through the underside of a garage door. There's lots of ways that these small pieces of burning material can get into the house. When you get other structures ignited, then you can get embers related to the combustion of those structures, and the embers often increase in size. I've seen whole 2x4s, I've seen garage doors, I've seen big things move, and the mitigation and exposure that a big piece of wood burning offers takes a much more nuanced approach to be able to manage those. And our defensible space work maybe doesn't address the management of embers as well as some other elements related to hardening the structure and thinking about the structure itself. The third type of exposure is something called radiant heat, and that's illustrated on the right here, where we've got a shed, could be pump house, could be a garden shed, it could be a tough shed, it could be your neighbor's house, it could be your detached secondary dwelling, it could be your man cave, it could be anything. And that building or vegetation ignites. It's in close enough proximity that the heat transfer that comes from the ignition of that building or that structure or that vegetation is sufficient to cause damage to the targeted structure, which is illustrated here as the house. And we commonly see windows break because of that heat exposure. So being aware of what else might ignite on the property is very critical. And then also applying the same framing to those situations so that even though you may think that the house is the part you're worried about and you don't care so much about the barn or the dog shelter or whatever it is, it has a high potential to have influence on the primary home. So how you manage the radiant heat piece is, involves both managing the vegetation as well as hardening both structures, especially when they're close. So I'm going to talk about direct flame contact, embers, and radiant heat as a way to describe what sort of pathways we see fire taking and exploiting on individual properties. Sound okay? Hoping so. If you haven't seen images like this before, this is a characterization through an actual photo of what an ember storm might look like. Often moving horizontally, often following the same pathways and collecting in the same locations where the leaves collect in the, in and around the structure. And they're everywhere, and they can find the small nooks and crannies. So thinking about the kind of ember exposure your buildings may experience takes a critical eye. What it often leads to is a situation where, this is taken in Lake Tahoe from a fire in 2007, where you would typically look at the post condition here and say, well, that had to have been a kitchen fire, or something happened because the vegetation wasn't involved at all. So how could that home be lost? And in reality, it's that the embers found a pathway into that building. This is the spot fire that we were talking about, but the spot fire is really in the structure itself. So the homes are often the most combustible parts of the landscape. Now this photo from the LA Times, to me, illustrates so much. It's modern new construction, looks like a courtyard. I don't know the rest of the context, but you can see these hot spots where there's a lot of combustion happening. You can see an individual firefighter really spending their time managing perhaps combustible mulch and distracted from other perhaps more important things. In my mind, when I look at this, I feel like I could have set that place up for better success and not have all of their time and effort focused on putting out little tiny spot fires here. There's some hot spots, and especially at the base of the wall. And I wonder if you might have an idea why there's that linear strip at the base of the wall. I don't know if you can see my cursor coming along here. Why is there so much concentration? And there's probably two things happening here. It could be the direction of the wind that's sending the embers there. But as the embers are traveling horizontally, they crash into the wall. And they don't stick to the wall, they drop to the base of the wall. And so they collect at the base of the wall and have plenty of opportunity to ignite combustibles that might be there. So you're going to hear us talk about, or hear me talk about, both a horizontal separation adjacent to the building as well as a vertical one. So where we can create at least 6 inches of non-combustible vertical separation, so the better, because of this exact situation where you see accumulation at the base of that wall because the wind distribution of embers, which then collect at the base. The other thing that I see in here is the vortexing around both doors. The one closest to the firefighter is vortexing kind of in an upward pattern. And you can imagine that those embers are then able to be exposed or put pressure on the under eave vents. Another horizontal surface, but it's above your head. You can also see the swirling that's happening to the door to the left, and you can see, the whirling that's happening, and just, lots and lots of transmission of those embers. So if you could go home and imagine this kind of exposure and think about, does that concern you? Do you feel like you've got most of those combustibles taken care of? And if that's the case, and A+ to you guys, great job. But if you go home and see things that could be combusted by these embers, I'd really encourage you to be thinking about what your plan is to be able to remove those and transition some of those. Couple more illustrations. This is from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. They have a lab. This is a real live big facility where they can build a building and then expose it to, in this case, the ember generator, which is showing the embers being thrown at the building. They put gusts of wind. They can do steady wind, gusted winds. And we've learned a lot from these more controlled settings. Again, you can see the embers landing at the base of the wall. You can see how they spray out around the corner. Lots of things happen at the corners of buildings. The next thing I'm going to show you really shows the enhanced vulnerability of corners. And so there is both controlled studies like this and post-fire investigations that are helping inform the set of recommendations that you're going to see here. So this next piece is a video. Let's see, I'm going to stop it if I can just for a second, and I'm going to take us back. So this is a side-by-side comparison, and what you're going to see is on the left is a shingle wood sided building. That's sort of less important. The more important piece is that it's surrounded by combustible mulch that is also underneath a combustible, in this case, step, but it's kind of simulating a deck. And that's in contrast to a building that is in gray there, which has fiber cement siding, but more importantly has rock mulch around the base of it. It does have some planted shrubs, which are separated from the building. And I believe the rock mulch also goes underneath the deck that's illustrated. In both cases, both buildings get the same type of exposure. And I want you to watch the time clock as I go through this, because the whole process happens really quickly. The one thing I want to say that's, I would love an in-between experiment here that has got the combustible siding, but then non-combustible rock mulch, to be able to show how wood siding itself is really able to be protected by managing that near to building combustible information or combustible area. So backing this up here, here's the start, right? So you can look down and see within 3 seconds, we've already got the planted vegetation starting to ignite, and we've got that on both sides of the deck. And I'm going to carry it out here and just watch what happens. So 4 seconds in, we've got flames that are already putting pressure on the combustible siding. We've got flame spread, and we've got it wrapping around the corners. You see the flames are farther away they extend out farther from the corners. We've got the side of the wall now being affected and the under eave area being exposed. We still don't have anything going on the non-combustible alternative option, even though they're also getting equal amount of ember spray. We've got ignition underneath the deck 32 seconds in. The whole process is happening super rapidly. In a second, we're going to go to the under eave area on the side of the house, and you can see that there's a lot of flame exposure that's happening there, and also starting to affect the gable indent. We're 50 seconds in. This process can happen really quickly. So if you've got questions about this, I'm just trying to suggest there's a body of evidence to really illustrate why the combustibles near to the house really can challenge the structure significantly. So again, as I sort of wrap up kind of the entry framing that we're thinking about, there are very specific vulnerable locations in buildings. Often those are, as illustrated on the left, the roof to wall transition, at the rain gutters, and at the roof edge. Also how fences attached to the buildings, they can serve as wicks, bringing fire from farther away towards the building. And then the bottom two are illustrations of embers penetrating the inside of the attic, and that's camera views that are mounted inside the attic as embers are thrown at them, and that's the little swirly stuff. So given that kind of framing, I'm going to now take us down into some different channels of research to also add to that conversation. Everybody doing okay?
Yeah, we're doing good. Keep it up.
Okay, excellent. So
actually, while we've got a break, Ken has his hand raised. Do you want to go ahead, Ken?
Yeah, I have a question. Did the other house ever combust?
It did not. It did not.
Okay.
But what I was trying to say is, like, it would be interesting to see that in between. Like, if you had the combustible siding but the non-combustible perimeter, what would you see? And I hypothesize that we would see no combustion of the building.
Thank you.
That's how important that that horizontal and vertical area is around the structure. Now, if you had attached trellises and other combustible items, it may be more easily, those might be more easily ignitable than just the horizontal wall of siding. So using that framework, I worked with some colleagues, both from the Forest Service and Steve Quarles, who I mentioned earlier, and we did an analysis. The paper is published. Taylor, you might, if you really want to nerd out, you can learn about it. I'm gonna sort of share what we were interested in. And if you look at the image on the right, this is an aerial image of the town of Paradise. And if you just look at the pattern, where's the green? You tend to see more green trees farther away from the homes than near the homes. If this had been a crown fire, a fire burning through the tall parts of the trees, all the trees would be lost. This was not a crown fire. It really was a surface-driven fire, as well as one with embers everywhere. And once they ignited the buildings, you can just really see a strong pattern of relationship with what the ignited buildings start to create on the vegetation. Now, we were curious about this because there are a relatively large population of homes that were built after that new construction code was put into effect, the exterior construction code, and we were curious, could we see that in the town of Paradise?
Can I interrupt real fast, Yana?
Yeah.
So we've got a question. Was it a root fire? Can you maybe expand on the difference between a canopy fire and your surface fire?
Yeah, I'm gonna show you some pictures, and I think you'll be able to see this. So the campfire starts basically as a down power line at 5:36 a.m. in the morning, and it moves really quickly. So I'll show you that in a minute. But I just want to say it wasn't just a wall of flame that led to the ignition of these structures. It was ember transmission, creating spot fires and penetration within individual buildings, and then you had a lot of building to building interaction. More like an urban fire in that setting. I think there's something for Utah to learn in terms of, I think these are similar vegetation types. This ponderosa pine forest with some element of hardwoods engaged. From a totally dispassionate, non-emotional viewpoint, incredible learning opportunity because there almost was no firefighter response or very limited response outside of evacuation, and it burned an entire community in 12 hours. So, great laboratory setting where you don't have that interaction effect of fire personnel having a lot of time and resources to try and put out fire on structures. So what happens in the absence, basically, of very limited response? So we were curious about how did other structures affect survival? How did vegetation come into play? And what was the effect of the building codes? And could we see a signature of that? So here is a broader illustration of, can you see my cursor now? Of the fire here. It starts off on the very left-hand side of the image in a wildland setting and managed forest areas, power line down. This picture is taken at 10:45 that morning. So it starts at 6 a.m. You can see the town is underneath these three main access points. The fire basically overwhelms, and we could go in long detail about it. I'm not going to go into too much the evacuation strategy, but you can see all of these spot fires that have ignited. They ignite in this canyon, and so you end up with different flaming fronts coming from different directions, and it just swallows up the town plus some surrounding communities here and here in Magalia and other locations. Our work focused just on the town of Paradise and the single family homes that were built there. So the first question we had to answer was, are the new homes all on one side of the town, or are they well distributed? And so this is showing around 8,000 single family homes coded by 3 time periods. That is the decade of period where we have new construction that meets the new standards, the decade just prior to that, and then all homes older than that decade. And so the prior homes are in gray, the very older homes are in gray, the decade before are in green, and the new homes are in red. What's great about seeing this is that they're well distributed throughout the town, not just in one corner. We were able to get access to data that is part of the post-fire investigation, and then we coded that into destroyed, damaged, and no impact. And if you look at it all, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Probably the survival percentage basically increases with time the weird decade splits are just because of that period of construction that we were super interested in. We subsample to the total population to match a rounded sample. Let's just get into the stats of it. And then we work on the variables that we can get access to. So looking at overstory, so the tree cover, visually estimated as shown on the right here in a couple different circles and donuts around the target structure, basically 30 meters or 100 feet, and then 100 meters or 300 feet. So, what was that vegetation type like in those areas? Then we also did some metrics that looked at distance to the nearest asteroid from the edge of the structure. And so that's what's shown on the bottom. And that was homes, businesses, garages, outbuildings, not just permitted houses. We were not able to look at understory cover, so the surface fuels, because we didn't have a pre-data set to be able to look at. We also looked at a variety of variables related to different land use codes and different densities and some other topographic variables. And there's a lot in this data set, which I'm not going to go through, but then this is sort of a wonky looking way to display the data, but we put all the data into an analysis, and there's lots of significant variables. But then we asked a computer to say, if you put everything in there, is there a way to make sense of it? Is there a strongest and next strongest relationship, and how would you display that? And that's what this decision tree shows. So if you look at the survival probability, the first split is, and the computer decides what the actual numerical split is, and it's quite interesting. So the first question we asked was, did proximity to nearby structures factor into the probability of survival? And what we saw, and this is not our number, it's the computer's generated number, is that basically an 18-meter or 54-foot separation is the biggest contributor to understanding survival probability. So the distance to the nearest destroyed structure, if it was greater than 54 meters, if 54 feet, excuse me, we had a higher probability of survival. If it was less than that, we had very low percentage of survival. So 73% of homes were within 18 meters of a destroyed structure. So huge, huge population. So that comment I made around radiant heat and then the generation of embers that comes from a burning building, both probably were at play there. So then after that split, so then is there anything that makes sense after that? And what we saw was the tree canopy cover had an effect, and a more moderate tree cover was helpful towards survival. And so when you think about trees, what do? They grow tall, they provide shade, they do all that stuff, but they also drop debris, branches, they drop leaves, they drop needles, maybe cones or acorns, and those things are all combustible. So you do see a lot of distribution of fuels related to trees, and they have a fairly big impact or a wide surface area that those materials are distributed. So that part really makes sense. And then we saw something pre-1970 and after 1970, and then slope had a little bit of effectiveness. So we saw, and here's the bottom take home, 73% probability of survival in homes were greater than 50 feet away from a destroyed structure. They had less than 50% canopy cover. They're built after 1973 and are on moderate slopes. And only 7% of the homes met that condition, which is telling as to why we lost so many structures during that fire. So, that's a piece of evidence. It's fairly, it's in line with some other with some other analyses of other wildfires. And so we've been really after this question of what is a reasonable safety and separation between structures. And that's a harder question to answer. We've got one data point, in this study of around 50 feet. And there's some more experiments that are really trying to look at that separation between structures. Of the homes that were just damaged but not destroyed, we poured through the images and did some analysis on that, and we see that 63% of the homes were damaged from radiant heat on the windows and exterior walls. So, as you can see, that community effect is fairly evident. If you look at it in a more subdivision urban context, you can see kind of that interaction effect of where if we're able to keep buildings together, then you can often hold the neighborhood together. But the neighborhood effect is relatively evidence that, once you've got loss of one, it has impact on the surrounding homes. So that is kind of depressing, but it also says we have to think about this from a community context, and we really have to work together as community members because the impact of our neighbors has an influence over our own building survival. Now, you're probably going, oh gosh, you've probably never seen my neighborhood, and my neighbor has, is a collector and a hoarder, and how am I ever going to get through them? And I would say, the way you address that is by leading by example, and your work will inspire other work. And yeah, it takes some time, but I have high degree of optimism that once we have a sense of what true adaptation looks like, we can really make a difference on our overall outcomes and situations. And we have to rally together to support those that are vulnerable, those that are least able, and everyone has something to bring to the table, whether it's making lunch, making phone calls, copying information, or getting out the hammer and doing some work. So then the last and probably most curious question is, what was the effect of that new building code? And what's interesting, so these are separated by decade, and the new building construction is the very column on the right. As I said, we have 140 homes in that population. You can see that the trend of survival increases through time. What we didn't see was a strong statistical difference between the decade before and the decade after the adoption. And that makes some sense to me, because when you think about the service life of materials, if a home was built in 1997, it's very likely that the initial roof is still on the house, and it's a good chance that that initial roof is still within its service life and doing well. Maybe it's getting closer for a replacement, but when you've got a roof that's 50 years old, it's likely to have begun to wear out, and the roof really shoulders the huge burden of responsibility on protecting the home. You also have double pane windows that are probably in good service from 1997 forward. So I think the point is that some of our newer construction materials are probably doing a lot better. The other piece is that the element of radiant heat is not well taken care of in the code from 2008. Our building code does get updated, and we're just going through an update right now, and radiant heat is becoming better addressed in terms of the assembly and products that are being chosen. The other piece to keep in mind is that there's also no standard prior to this fire around combustibles immediately adjacent to the house. So it's pretty haphazard in how people interpreted that. And so there were a lot of near home combustibles, bark mulch, woody plants, stored materials around home. So there's an interaction effect with this defensible space concept. So going forward, I think we're going to see a huge improvement in survival in newer homes, both because our standards for defensible space have gone up, as well as improvements to the construction code. So what do we do, though, with all those other homes out there? And that's a question that we're going to have to answer carefully and thoughtfully in terms of the carrot versus stick approach. And I think once I understand an issue, I have a much better chance to actually make change and think about things that I can do as a part of my regular maintenance activities that might make a difference. I hope you'll join me in that philosophy. So now I want to move forward and talk about a grassland fire. And I bring this forward because grassland fires are different than forest fires, and in part because the embers that come from grasslands are not long-lived, and they're not as durable, and they don't penetrate vents as well. And so you don't see a number of gutter fires here, and you see different issues. So let's understand the vegetation type that that we're working under. So here's an image of Boulder, Colorado. Again, it's on the beginning of the plains on the backside of the Rocky Mountains. Lots of neighborhoods that were constructed of common time period, relatively modern construction standards, different from where I work. And so the team I got invited to join was really after this question of, can we see effect of a construction style that maybe made a difference? And we were looking at places like this where you could see a component of a neighborhood burned, and then then other surrounding areas where the fire didn't extend. And so we were curious, was there something specific about that block that made it more vulnerable, or what happened? So getting to the spoiler alert, what happened in this situation, why the fire stopped where it did, is that there was response from some level of fire personnel and sometimes some community action. And the difference between these buildings and the ones that are surviving in construction style is negligible. It really was that there was someone able to take a stand and sort of prevent some of that wicking and that pathway of fire from one building to the next. That may be a little bit discouraging, but I think if we understand the pathways, we understand ways to mitigate. So in a community like this, where there isn't a lot of topography to create separation between buildings, and there isn't a lot of natural vegetation to do that, how do we create privacy, and how do we create a space called home? I don't know what you see in these images, but what I see is really an interconnected, almost spaghetti network of fences, wood fences in particular. You create privacy and security through creating a fenced yard in a place where you don't have a lot of those other natural features to work off of. And that's lovely. I mean, I'm a forester. I love building and working with wood, and I have no problem building and working with wood going into the future. But what I do see is that when we attach those fences directly to the building, we're essentially attaching a fuse or a wick to bring fire directly to our houses. So in this situation, we had a grassland fire with a high wind component on it, and we had a connection of grass bringing fire to running into the built environment. In this case, it generally was the fence. And with collected debris at the base of the fence, that got ignited. That's like the kindling, and then the fence itself could become ignited. And then that fence fire essentially brought the fire to the structure. So is it possible to interrupt that? Absolutely. And how might you interrupt that? Think about it for a minute. It's relatively easy to do that. It's really about creating a transition from the wood fence to the house and filling that transition zone with something that won't burn. So that could be a metal gate, that could be any number of ways to change the materials that finish that closure point from the fence to the house. So new stuff to think about, but leaving those attached fences that run perpendicular to the structure is really problematic. I'm going to fast forward to now looking at different building products and building materials. So here's an illustration of brand new kind of condo area in Boulder. And what we had was firefighters really take a stand in the evening and really say, we're going to do everything we can to hold the line. There's a path and walkway that they worked off of, and there was a row of structures that was lost. And here you can see the effect of radiant heat damage onto this new set of built condos. I think they're from 2020, so darn brand new materials. And what's interesting to me is to look at the effect of window capacity to absorb heat and manage it. So I'm going to use two terms, annealed versus tempered glass. And the reason, do you know why the reason is we have tempered glass? And tempered glass is used here in the case of where there's a sliding glass door. So why do you use tempered glass? And that is because occasionally we walk through a glass door and you want to change how the glass breaks so that you don't succumb from shards of glass coming down around you. Tempering changes the way that the glass breaks. But tempered glass also has the added benefit of being 3 times stronger and more capable of resisting heat than annealed glass does. Tempered glass more expensive. So here you can see side by side tempered glass using the sliding glass door, annealed glass in the above area that's just used for light. Those probably aren't operable windows, so less resistive to heat. And you can see that the annealed glass windows broke and you had full access into the building because of that, whereas the tempered glass, we lost the screens, we're able to withstand it. So where you have buildings that are close to each other where radiant heat is a likely issue, the use of tempered glass far better than annealed glass. I'll tell you that 95% of us all have annealed glass as the primary window type we have, except for in these door situations. You can also see on the lower right how broken glass leads to the melted vinyl blinds, and so it's just a good illustration of the way building products perform under exposure. I'm going to show a couple more examples of fences bringing fire to the structure and the use of heavy timbers to build retaining walls. In both of these cases, the fire didn't self-extinguish. We had firefighter response that prevented that from continuing. In some cases, they were able to prevent the buildings from igniting. In other cases, they weren't. Here's another illustration. This is kind of the detective work we do. And the structure is still standing on the left-hand side because there was firefighter response. On the right-hand side, you can see what it was abutting to, and that was able to help manage exposure to the building that does survive because there is response. What we ultimately concluded is that there were multiple pathways into this structure. In this case, it's a wood fence. It's wrapped in stucco. What happens is that the embers come over, land on this grassy area. The snow is, what helped put the fire out. So at the time of ignition, there wasn't snow. The fire worked its way towards the base of this fence. There's hardware cloth to kind of keep animals from going in and out. The base of the hardware cloth is collected debris. There is a bender board for decorative kind of garden separation between the mowed grass and the flowers and other shrubs that were planted. There's also a privacy fence that separates the property from the neighbor. And what happens is you get ignition basically at the base of that wall. It goes into the fence, and the fence ignites, and then it makes a hard turn and attaches to this stucco section of housing. And then the only wood that is exposed are in two locations, and they are underneath the eaves here, and they're also at the very base of the stucco. They're part of the layer that's exposed at the base of the wall. What happens is you get enough heat and flame coming off of that attached fence that it basically penetrates the attic and goes into the attic. So if you look at it from the other side, here's how the fence would have aligned, and here's how it got into the building. So, wow, could we have done something about that? Heck yeah. I'm telling you, if we had detached the fence from the house, my guess is we probably would have seen the structure survive if they had also thought about two other elements. So this is another part of that same house. We've got a rock mulch with some woody plants in the rock mulch. Kind of less common to ignite woody plants without, especially this conifer tree, without a surface fire. But in the conifer tree's case, it held on to a lot of its needles, and with wind distributed embers, pretty easy for one to lodge inside this kind of almost short-statured, outgrown Christmas tree, shall we call it. And we got ignition in that Christmas tree. It produced flames. Again, we had another pathway into the under eave area, which is made of a fiberboard and way for fire to get in. Here's another example of some of the shrubs, and you can see the pressure it put on the vent here, and we had flame penetration of the vent. So could we do something about this? In my mind, absolutely. And it would be great not to have those pieces of vegetation right there and no combustibles there. We also did quite a bit of work, and I just want to share that if you look at the stucco cladding, the underlying sheathing and combustible eaves are both fire vulnerable. So here's here's how I was showing you. This is a wood fiber. This is looking up at the assembly of the stucco wall. At the base of the wall, there's a fiber board that's basically sticking out. So if we had had ignition at the base of the wall, very easily we would have had fire go behind the stucco and right into the wall assembly. So super easy for fire to get in. I want to offer just a couple illustrations of surviving homes. So this is again in Boulder, Colorado, and this is the only home that survives in a community of about 17, 18 homes, and it survived by just barely escaping. Lots of things that are right. You can see these rock walkways. You can see relatively little vegetation that's near to the home. The garden beds are separated from the structure. The structure is of a non-combustible material. And gutters aren't an issue because there's no trees that are overhanging. But when you flip, and here's an adjacent building that was burned. When you flip around to the front side of the house, there was a courtyard, little bare, wood doors, and a near miss here because you can see the smoldering both at the bare and the door, and then just to the left of the door is a garden bed that had woody vegetation in it, and we had full ignition there, and that also led to ignition of the decorative or the chairs that are sitting outside. So real close there. Here's another one from Paradise, and every building is lost around this for probably a mile or more. Huge ember exposure to this structure, but they had the new vents that are designed to resist both flames and embers. They had a great roof. They had a tall foundation, so those embers that accumulate at the base couldn't ignite. This leaf litter is new, it's post-fire. So putting the pieces together, we can see signs of success. So I know we're getting close to the Q&A time. I've just got a few more slots about concluding things that are worth thinking about from these two studies. In the past, we would look at an image like this and say, everything's great, no worries, irrigated lawn, mowed, pruned up vegetation. And my new fresh eyes say, but look at all that woody vegetation smothering the house. We've got to figure out now how to move that. So you'll see work that Taylor and others in Utah talk about, really illustrating a 3-zone concept now. I think I've given you some ideas to think about where that's coming from. These are some of our California graphics. I know that she's used some of the National Fire Protection Association graphics, but what we're really moving to is nothing combustible in that first 5 feet of the structure and around all the attachments, such as stair landings and decks and things like that. And really this idea that when you've got buildings that are closer to each other, California law doesn't mandate you work in your neighbor's property, but the point being that there's sort of shared responsibility, and let's figure out how we can work together as communities to address these issues. There's lots of questions about fire safe plant lists. I'm going to tell you they're all flawed, and they all have problems, and don't rely on a label to give you an outcome of success, because vegetation changes through time, and how I manage vegetation, how you manage vegetation, totally different. Here's two plant types that we see in California sometimes, and you can see how they accumulate dead material, and if we don't maintain it, we really have a lot of fire hazard that comes with that. And these are things that are within our capacity. So placement, much more important than plant type. And I, earlier illustrated that there's a lot of ways to harden a structure, and part of that is understanding those vulnerable locations. So as I wrap up here, here's some of the concluding thoughts. And I forgot, Taylor, to give you the links to these. We'll do it in a second. But a roof that is in good shape is really critical. Most of us have what's called the Class A roof. If you have an old shingle roof like I've had in the past, that's not going to cut it. Why the roof? Because it's the largest horizontal surface on the building, and it is protecting the building from rain and hail and snow and the sun's rays and all of that stuff. The roof's got to be in good shape. We want to see some flashing at the edge of the roof line so that if you get ignition in a gutter, it doesn't penetrate the under area of the roof. A boxed-in eave, far better than an open exposed rafter tail eave. We want people to be thinking about the vents and whether they're both ember and flame resistant. I've got an image of that in a minute. Thinking about, the roof to wall intersections, really being clear that we're not putting combustibles underneath decks, and this non-combustible gate attachment, just as an example. And when your buildings are within 30 feet of each other, trying to upgrade the windows to tempered glass on the sides where those buildings could put pressure on each other. So, in coming back, the roof, the vents, and the defensible space are all the key things to think about. But where you get denser and greater proximity from one building to the next, really start thinking about how radiant heat could be addressed. We're currently working from a 30-foot separation viewpoint as kind of that critical threshold, but we're still trying to modify our thinking, and there's some more research in that space. So here's the conclusion. So, and in my mind, home loss is totally predictable. And we can do something about it, though. There are changes that we can do. And that, to me, there's a formula and there's a pathway forward. And that gives me the sense that there's reason for hope. It's not all lost. We can really turn the ship in this perspective. We don't fight as a country earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes. What do? We adapt and we build smarter, or we retrofit smarter. And I think we can apply that same philosophy to the fire space. Once we understand that embers are such a critical component of this, and we think about this not just from a forest fire viewpoint. So the question that I think we philosophically have to figure out and politically need to figure out is, how do we incentivize upgrades to our existing homes, both for ember and radiant heat? How do we protect that are most vulnerable? And how do we move forward in both the carrot and stick approach so that the broad public understands what their risks are and how they can make informed decisions that make a difference, and still provide the beauty and the aesthetics and the comfort and all the function that we want out of our homes. So I'll conclude by saying, what do we do in these situations? Well, clearly we've got to manage some of that immediate dry vegetation, but there are other elements on the home that we need to think about. What do we do for those that are most vulnerable? Here's a trailer that is protected with a roof attachment over it. It's got lots of gaps, lots of places for embers to get a way in. I don't approach this person like, oh, I'm so sorry you live there. I approach a person like this and go, oh my gosh, look at that amazing view you have. Wow, you get to live in the coolest place ever. How can I help you manage some of the issues that might affect you? What do we do in this kind of situation? Is this home protected? Spoiler alert, the answer, no. This home was succumbed to wildfire. This is a Utah-based picture. There's a lot of things that look right here. But maybe when they evacuated, they left a window open, or they left the garage open, or there was a gap underneath the garage door. Paying attention to those details is what's critically important. We've got a year with lots of rainfall that's going to really stimulate the grass load, and we're going to have a lot of vegetation to manage. It's going to take multiple passes to do that. But as we start to apply some of this framing and philosophy and understand the pathways, we can think about the extra stuff we can do to make a difference in approaching this year's wildfire season. So Taylor, I'm going to copy these links and get out of presenter mode and be able to share some of the resources that we're using both in California and some from around the country to try and explore and expose a broader set of resources to our communities. So thank you for being a very patient audience. And let's see. All right, how am I doing?
That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that information. I will now open it up to questions. You guys can feel free to use the chat box or use the raise your hand tool. It's the little hand icon down at the bottom. While you guys are thinking about all of that information she shared, I might ask you a question. So you've got a personal and a professional viewpoint living in the wildland-urban interface. What would your key takeaway be if this was a new concept to you?
I think my primary message is, so for me, I'm an extension agent. I work with people all the time, and think a lot of people feel really defeated in this space. And I'm really trying to lead with the optimism that there are things that we can do. And I try to be positive, solution oriented, and empowering. And I think we now have a very clear understanding of what those pathways are. And so it takes maybe a little vocabulary detanglement, but illustrating that there are very specific actions that we can take. Some of them not expensive at all. It's really just a little bit of sweat labor, and we can have a significant impact on our future outcome. It'd be nice to feel like you're one and done. One action is going to be it. I mean, this is maintenance stuff, and it's more reason to be dedicating a little bit of extra time to some of that maintenance. But there's a lot of work that we can do, and we don't just have to feel like we're sitting ducks, vulnerable to everything and anything that comes our way.
Definitely. I love your optimistic outlook on all of this too. I have to say, I think that's what we all needed to hear personally, because it is overwhelming, like you said, and it can be very frustrating, but where it is predictable and there are things and steps that we can take and implement to change the outcome, that's exactly what we needed to hear. Got a lot of really positive feedback in the chat box so far. They were asking about having your slides available to them. Is that all right?
Yeah, we'll work on that. I can make that happen. Give me a few days. I'm managing a few things in my own personal life that might take me a couple of days to get it all to you, but yes.
Yeah, no worries. And we will have this recording available on our Forestry, Fire, and State Lands YouTube channel. So you can check it out there. We'll make the slideshow available as well. There was one other thing that you said we could come back to. So when we were talking about planning, thinking about where you will be in the event of a wildfire, can you maybe elaborate on that?
Right. Well, so coming back to that idea of, I don't know who's all on this call exactly, and what, whether you're in a leadership role within your community or just interested community members. What I hear is a lot of folks have, like, some of the most prepared folks have a binder, and in the crisis moment, they open the binder and they go, oh, here's my things that I do. And it's like so amazing to sort of think about, oh yeah, you do sort of, when you panic, like, what is it you're supposed to do? And I love that, that they have a way to go, oh yeah, right, step 1, I turn the water on. Step 2, I close the window. Step 3, I grab my go bag. Step 4, whatever it is. But what happens if you're not home, right? And you're at work, or a medical need takes you away from home. So we have things called red flag warnings, right? Which are conditions when wildfire ignition could lead to rapid fire spread. So when we're in a red flag warning condition, I try and practice a lot of that stuff. Maybe I leave a go bag in my car regularly. I take my animals with me more often than leave them at home. I don't leave the window open. I close the skylight. I do things that are under the idea that I want to seal the exterior of my perimeter of my house up, and I just leave during the summer months or the wildfire months a ladder left at the near the house, so if someone is a first responder, they could manage a spot fire that's in the gutter. I have good signage. I have, especially for those that are more rural, and you might have your own kind of fire suppression system with water lines and other resources. The blue dotted system we use here, where there's a reflector where those supplies and materials are accessible and ready. I've done things so that it's easy to interpolate that if someone comes to work on my place, that they're all the successes. In that same case where I was talking about the people that have the checklist, they also have a signage at the base of their incredibly steep driveway that says, this size fire engine can drive up this road, and there is safe staging, and there is a turnaround, and don't worry about adventuring up my driveway because you'll find something that's in good working order. They're constantly thinking about, they're not going to be the person that communicates to that outside personnel team that's coming in. In a large wildfire, it may not be your local people that are responding. It's crews from other states, other communities that don't know your area. So everything you can do to communicate so it's easy and understandable, and they're willing to invest their time and energy into approaching your property is critical. And then also keep in mind that maybe there won't be those available resources, not because they don't care, but just because they're focused on the evacuation of people.
Definitely. That is great. We've got a few minutes left. I don't know if anybody has any questions. Carl, would you mind putting the link to the survey in the chat box? We had issues last time, but I think we got it figured out. And I guess if nobody has any questions, I'll throw in another one. So we found that the defensible space reaches out to that 100-foot zone, approximately, given the terrain. There's a lot of variables that come into play. And then if you do happen to reach your neighbor's property boundary before you get to that 100-foot zone, can you expand on what you would recommend there?
Right. So just to be clear, California law doesn't say it's 100 feet in any direction. You run into property lines and you're done. What I would say is you really work as a community together to think about those. I mean, there are a lot of situations where you have tiny lots and you only have 5 feet from the edge of the wall to the neighboring property transition, and there's a wood fence perhaps that separates one property from the next. In that case, in any case, the point is, I think, start with yourself and start with managing the stuff on your own place first. Your neighbor will be far more willing to engage with you if you've already done the work and not just in a blame situation. I mean, lots of folks are like, well, if only my neighbor, blah, 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 blah. If they had done this, then maybe I'd be willing. How you inspire others to do work is really by taking the first step and engaging in that space. So if they see you replacing a window, they'll be like, what are you doing? Well, I'm upgrading to tempered glass windows because I'm concerned about our wood fence that separates our two properties. Yes, I know it's important for us to have, this property separation so your animals stay where they are, your kids stay where they are, but I'm trying to mitigate the potential risk that comes with that. And maybe in that case, you say, next time it's time to replace the fence, why don't we move to something that's non-combustible because the houses are so close to each other. And maybe you share the expenses in that way. So the point that I want to have is, and if you have ways that your communities talk, maybe you have a neighborhood watch program, that you bring some of these ideas into your natural flow. Maybe you have a breakfast, a community gathering, maybe you have a 4th of July party or something like that. Just try and bring in a few ideas and see if you can inspire others to be able to work together and think about these issues. And as I said, really surround, where are the folks that are disabled? Where are the single moms? Where are the elderly? Maybe they can't do this stuff all on their own, but together you can lend your time and energy and make a work party happen.
That is so helpful. It looks like we're about out of time. So if there are no other questions, I would just like to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to get on the webinar tonight. And Yana, I can't thank you enough for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And I wish you all the best. And I hope to see you guys on April 19th. We'll have our next webinar that night on safe and effective wildfire response. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great night.
lots of folks are like, well, if only my neighbor, blah, 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 blah. If they had done this, then maybe I'd be willing. You know, how you inspire others to do work is really by taking the first step and engaging in that space. So if they see you replacing a window, they'll be like, what are you doing? Well, I'm upgrading to tempered glass windows because I'm concerned about our wood fence that separates our two properties. Yes, I know it's important for us to have, you know, this property separation so your animals stay where they are, your kids stay where they are, but I'm trying to mitigate the potential risk that comes with that. And maybe in that case, you say, you know, next time it's time to replace the fence, why don't we move to something that's non-combustible because the houses are so close to each other, and maybe you share the expenses in that way. So the point that I want to have is, you know, and if you have ways that your communities talk, maybe you have a neighborhood watch program, that you bring some of these ideas into your natural flow. Maybe you have a breakfast, you know, a community gathering. Maybe you have a, you know, a 4th of July party or something like that. Just try and bring in a few ideas and see if you can inspire others to be able to work together and think about these issues. And as I said, really surround, you know, where are the folks that are disabled? Where are the, you know, the single moms? Where are the elderly? You know, maybe they can't do this stuff all on their own, but together you can lend your time and energy and make a work party happen.
That is so helpful. It looks like we're about out of time. So if there are no other questions, I would just like to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to get on the webinar tonight. And Yana, I can't thank you enough for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And I wish you all the best. And I hope to see you guys on April 19th. We'll have our next webinar that night on safe and effective wildfire response. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great night.